Thank you for joining us on WomenHeart's Facebook page for How We Fight Live, Living an Empowered Life with Heart Failure. My name is Liz Mikla, and I will be your moderator for today's broadcast. We're here today to raise awareness of heart failure, which affects nearly 3 million women in the U.S. alone. And we're here to inspire, empower, and activate women to advocate for themselves and take action to manage their heart failure. This event is hosted by WomenHeart, the National Coalition for Women with Heart Disease, and nationally sponsored and supported by Novartis Pharmaceuticals Corporation. WomenHeart is the nation's only patient-centered organization that's solely dedicated to support, education, and advocacy for women living with or at risk of heart disease. Last year, they launched the How We Fight campaign to empower women with heart failure to take action, which was also supported and sponsored by Novartis Pharmaceuticals Corporation. Women in particular face unique heart failure challenges such as depression, misdiagnosis, and even delays in diagnosis, but they bravely persevere. Today, we'll hear from 2 women living with heart failure and a cardiologist about the 2 types of chronic heart failure, the emotional and physical toll of heart failure, and ways to empower women living with or at risk of heart failure. And of course, we want to hear from you, our audience. We are taking audience questions in a Q&A later in the program. So please post your questions in the comments and we'll try to get to as many as possible. But remember, we will not be talking about treatment today, so we ask that any questions or comments you post do not mention specific medications or drug classes. Also, please don't share any personal health information in your comments. To kick off our show, let's meet Molly. Her story gives us a glimpse of one woman's experience with heart failure, giving us an idea of what those who have heart failure endure in their lives. Let's take a look.
I feel guilty and ashamed that I have heart failure. How do I deal with those feelings? After heart failure, I can say that the feelings of guilt and shame are definitely real. They are powerful. They can cause depression. I get it. I was depressed. And I also feel that they are based on fear. And what I think worked for me was taking those feelings and turning them into awareness and empowerment. And I think it was a quote that my mother sent me that was my turnaround. And the quote read, "Not all storms come to disrupt your life. Some storms come to clear your path." And that really resonated inside me. It sparked an energy in me to make a change. And I took all of the energy that I was putting towards that negativity and I started putting it towards more positive. I started becoming aware. I did that by asking my doctor more questions. I learned more about my heart disease. And then finally, my biggest piece of advice, which I think is the most important, is self-love. And I don't think we do that enough. We always have such busy lives in our careers, with our children, with our family members. We help others, and we don't ever take the time to take care of ourselves and just love ourselves. Take 20 minutes, put it on your calendar. Read your favorite book for 20 minutes, or turn up the music as loud as you can to your favorite songs and just dance, or take a walk, or spend time with another loved one laughing. It was so good for you, and we tend to forget that. And in 42 years, I have never felt better than I do right now. So don't give up hope. Remember to love yourself as well as loving others. And remember, keep fighting. We are worth it. I am a WomenHeart champion, and this is how we fight.
Molly's journey is far too common, as you'll hear from our panelists today. And joining us is cardiologist and WomenHeart Scientific Advisory Council member, Dr. Alanna Morris, along with 2 WomenHeart champions and heart failure patients, Lori and Porothea. We'll be talking about the 2 types of chronic heart failure, hear firsthand how heart failure can affect women emotionally and physically, and importantly, discuss what you can do to live an empowered life with heart failure. First off, let's talk to Dr. Morris to learn more. Dr. Morris, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So we've all heard about heart failure, but probably don't really understand it completely. Can you describe to us what is chronic heart failure?
Absolutely, Liz. Thank you for having me. Heart failure is a chronic, progressive condition where the heart cannot pump or fill properly, so it can't meet the body's need for blood and oxygen. For a typical person, the heart works by filling with blood and then pumping to release the blood throughout the body, carrying oxygen and important nutrients that your body needs to work properly. With heart failure, this process is disrupted. There are two types of chronic heart failure with reduced ejection fraction and heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. With heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, also known as HFrEF or systolic heart failure, the heart can't pump with enough force to push the blood throughout the body and deliver the oxygen that the body needs. In this type of heart failure, again called HFrEF, there are approved guideline recommended treatment options for people living with HFrEF. So there are a lot of things that we can do to make these patients feel better and live longer. Heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, also known as HFpEF or diastolic heart failure, is when the heart muscle becomes thick and stiff. It can't expand to fill properly with the blood to circulate it to the muscles. Interestingly, more women than men have HFpEF. And this one is real difficult because there are no approved medicines for HFpEF that are proven to lower the risk of death with this condition. There are some interventions to help people with HFpEF to monitor and relieve their symptoms, as well as manage other chronic conditions and make lifestyle changes like regular exercise and weight loss. It's important for patients to remember that the symptoms of HFrEF and HFpEF are really very similar. In fact, in many cases, the same. Symptoms like persistent cough, shortness of breath, swelling of the feet and ankles or the abdomen, as well as nausea and fatigue. And while heart failure can affect anyone, there are certainly certain factors that place patients at greater risk. Certain conditions like having high blood pressure, obesity, diabetes, and coronary artery disease increase the risks of developing heart failure, as well as getting older. Increasing age is one of the most common risk factors for developing heart failure.
Super helpful explanation, Dr. Morris. Thank you. And so you mentioned the two types of chronic heart failure, HFpEF and HFrEF. So how is each type diagnosed?
Sure. Heart failure is a clinical diagnosis, and it's important to remember that because it really is based primarily on the symptoms that a person is experiencing. So when you go to your doctor, your nurse practitioner, or another clinician who's taking care of you, they really have to sort through the symptoms that you are having and experiencing. If it appears as though those symptoms are suggestive of a diagnosis of heart failure, they will usually order a number of tests. One of the most common tests that we typically order is a test called an echocardiogram. And that echocardiogram will allow us to measure something called the ejection fraction. This is a measurement that allows us to see the amount or the proportion of blood that the heart is pushing out every time that it beats. If that ejection fraction is low, lower than normal, we can usually fairly easily say, okay, you have HFrEF or systolic heart failure. And again, sometimes that's a relatively easy diagnosis to make, and we can often start prescribing the multiple medications that are available for patients with HFrEF. As I mentioned before, however, the HFpEF diagnosis can be a little bit more challenging to make because, again, with those patients, the ejection fraction will come back as normal. It can be within the normal range. But we have to remember that those patients are still having the same types of symptoms, that shortness of breath, that swelling, that fatigue. And so even though the ejection fraction is saying that the heart function is normal, the patient is experiencing some symptoms of heart failure. And so in that case, the diagnosis would still be heart failure, but in this case, heart failure with preserved ejection fraction or HFpEF. And both of those diagnoses can have a significant impact on patients' lives, both emotionally as well as physically.
Thank you for walking us through all of that. And so it sounds like while HFrEF and HFpEF may look the same from the outside, HFpEF is harder to diagnose and treat. So Dr. Morris, can you tell us more about how heart failure might affect women specifically?
Sure, there are 3 million women in the US living with heart failure, and they do face unique challenges in seeking and receiving the care that they need. For example, women are more likely to have a delayed or perhaps incorrect diagnosis. Doctors can miss or misinterpret symptoms of heart failure in women. Many times this is because certain symptoms like fatigue or weight gain in women can often be misinterpreted as menopause or other conditions. We often find that doctors, nurse practitioners, or other clinicians don't necessarily think about the possibility of heart failure in women, particularly in younger women. I think we often still think of heart disease as a man's disease and don't necessarily think of heart failure or other cardiac conditions in women as the primary diagnosis. The other thing is women often don't think that they could be affected by heart disease. From what I've seen throughout my career working with women in heart failure, women are often spectacular caregivers for their husbands or children, but when they are affected with a chronic heart condition, they often struggle to care for themselves in the same way that they care for others. They often downplay their symptoms because they don't want to be a burden to others. They may blame themselves for having symptoms, and they may wait longer to seek care. They may misinterpret or ignore their symptoms, even when those symptoms are worsening. And in those cases, their symptoms may be delayed in terms of being treated. So for all of these reasons, we can see delays in diagnosis and treatment, and these things can be very difficult for our female patients and can lead to mental struggles as well as depression. In fact, women are more likely than men to experience depression when living with heart failure.
Well, really interesting. Thank you, Dr. Morris, for that good overview. And for everyone listening at home, we'd like to hear from you. Did you know that women are more likely than men to experience depression when living with heart failure? So send us a yes or no in the comments. Well, we have a lot to unpack with today's panel, so let's get to it. And if you're just joining us, we're discussing heart failure and how it affects women. So let's welcome back Dr. Morris, the cardiologist, and two brave women, Lori and Porothea, who are living with HFpEF and HFrEF. We'll be discussing how they overcame the challenges of managing heart failure. And as a reminder, later in the show, we'll have a Q&A. So please post your questions in the comments, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. But remember, we will not be talking about treatment today, and please do not share any personal health information in your comments. Welcome, Lori and Porothea. How are you?
Hi.
Well, can you both tell us a little bit about yourself and about your diagnosis journey, including which type of heart failure you have? So, Porothea, why don't we start with you?
Hi, I'm Porothea. I am a mother of 4, a grandmother of 14, and I'm a nurse practitioner. I'm very excited to be here. But on October 29th, 2017, I had a heart attack and a stroke. I woke up at 4 a.m. in the morning and I could not walk. My daughter got me to the hospital, which is literally right around the corner from us. They did the workup. The physician came in and he says, well, you've had a stroke. And being that I am a nurse practitioner, I'm like, I figured that based on the fact that I couldn't walk. He said, but you've also had a heart attack. And I said, I had a what? He said, you had a heart attack. I didn't have any chest pains. I didn't have any shortness of breath. I just could not walk. So I got admitted. And for the whole month of November, I was in and out of the hospital. They would discharge me, and within an hour, I would be right back because I would have what was called pulmonary flash edema from my heart failure. They ended up putting a stent in me. I was 80% occluded in that vessel. And so after that, my journey started. It really hit me then that I was living with heart failure.
Well, Porothea, thank you for sharing your background story. No doubt this has been quite a journey for you as you go through this. And Lori, can you tell us a little bit about you and your diagnosis?
Sure. So I'm Lori, and I'm excited to be here as well. I have 4 adult children, if you count my son-in-law, which I always do. Since I don't have any grandchildren like Porothea does, I'm going to tell you I have a miniature dachshund named Pearl, and I'm married to my high school sweetheart. I'm a writer. I was diagnosed with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction almost 5 years ago. It was Thanksgiving week of 2015, and we all know that's a short week. That's a busy week. I wasn't feeling well leading into that week. I just was exhausted. I was having trouble breathing. And my first thought was, I have the flu. Even though I had taken the flu shot a month or so before that, I thought maybe I'm getting a different strain of the flu. And then it kept getting worse. And I thought, well, this could be pneumonia. I've never had pneumonia. So I went to urgent care on Monday because it was that short, busy week. And the first time on Monday when I went, they gave me an inhaler. And I just wasn't getting any better. And by Wednesday, I went back to urgent care and they gave me an antibiotic. And I thought, I'm just going to lay low. I'm going to spend the day. I spent the Thanksgiving day in bed. My family was here and they prepared the meal and I just stayed in bed. I thought I'm going to let this thing run its course. But on Friday, when I was even worse, I made an appointment with my primary care physician and he ran some diagnostic tests and immediately identified my heart failure. I was direct admitted to cardiac ICU where I spent 2 weeks, and that included a flight to a larger hospital for a consultation.
Wow, it sounds like such a difficult ordeal that you both went through. Thank you, Lori and Porothea, for sharing that. We are truly grateful to have you here with us today to share your stories and your background. So, Dr. Morris, both Lori and Porothea kind of noted hospitalizations as part of their journeys. Can you tell us more about what a heart failure hospitalization entails?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it is incredibly important for us to talk about this. And again, I thank Lori and Porothea for sharing their stories. The fact that they were hospitalized at any point during their course is critical. It really means that they were quite ill. And it really doesn't necessarily matter that at some point a stent was placed or that Lori was in the ICU. Certainly that speaks to the acuity and the level of illness. But the fact that they had to go to the hospital because they were feeling so ill in and of itself means that something was wrong and that we really have to take that seriously. Needing to go to the hospital for any reason for heart failure is a sign that the condition is getting worse. In fact, heart failure is a leading cause of hospitalization nationwide, and both types of heart failure can cause recurring hospitalizations. In fact, about 1 million hospitalizations every year in the US are caused by heart failure. That's around 2 hospitalizations every single minute, and the chance of dying grows after the first visit to the hospital and with each visit after. So it's very important to manage the condition to avoid ending up in the hospital by adhering to medications that you may be prescribed to reduce the risk of hospitalization, as well as some of the lifestyle tips that we'll talk about shortly.
Good recommendations. Thank you, Dr. Morris. Lori and Porothea, being hospitalized must have been shocking and scary for you and your families, I can imagine. So what was it like for you to be hospitalized for heart failure? And can you tell us about what that experience was like? Lori, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I think shock is the operative word for my situation. I went within hours from thinking I was going to my family doctor, maybe I was going to get a steroid shot, to speaking to a cardiologist I'd never seen before, telling me that I was going to need a heart transplant. I was in ICU. I had defibrillator pads stuck to my chest. There was a heart by my door. It was all so foreign. I felt like I had been airdropped into the middle of someone else's life. Because I had no risk factors. I had no family history. I didn't even know what shortness of breath really was. I didn't know the difference between a heart attack and heart failure. The nurses were coming in and looking at my numbers and looking at me and tearing up and asking if I had walked in on my own. And my children were there with all of this going on in the hospital. It was hard for them. They heard it all firsthand with me. It was confusing, and it was just a very shocking experience. My brother visited, and I could tell by the things that he was saying and doing that he wasn't sure I was going to survive either. So not only for me, but for my entire family, it was a very unsettling experience.
Well, that must have been so difficult, Lori. Thank you for sharing that. Porothea, can you tell us a bit about what your hospitalization experience was like?
My hospitalization experience was terrifying. And it was terrifying because I was on the other side this time. I was the patient and not the person taking care of the patient. I remember bargaining with my maker, saying, if you just, let me live. I remember saying, if I'm going to die, just let me go home and die at home. I remember calling my daughter, my oldest daughter, at 3:00 in the morning, telling her I love her because she said I didn't tell her enough, and then subsequently calling the other children. I remember calling my mother the next day, and she's like, am I going to lose you? I'm like, no, Mom, just to reassure her. But deep down, I really felt like I was going to leave this world. So it was very terrifying for me also.
Wow, what you had to endure is so incredible. Thank you, Porothea. So, Lori and Porothea, your heart failure journeys thus far, including your hospitalization, sound like they were so challenging. And I'm sure our viewers would like to know how you're doing now. So, can you share some of the things you've learned and how you're managing your condition? Lori?
Oh yeah, sure. So I'm doing better. My ejection fraction has increased, and my goal is to get it closer to normal. I'm being treated with a combination of medications and device and lifestyle changes. And the main lifestyle changes are a low sodium diet, daily exercise, rest, adequate rest. But of all of those, by far the biggest one that I've had to make has been with the diet. And by diet, I mean low sodium diet. When my children were small and still living at home, we were a busy family. And I still made it a priority to cook dinner and eat at home every night for supper. But because we were so busy, I was relying on things like, convenience foods like packaged sauces or box mixes or canned goods. And some of those can be really high in sodium. So I've had to really learn how to cook all over again. Now, when we go to the grocery store, the first thing I'll do when I take something off the shelf is turn it around and look at the nutrition label on the back to see how much sodium is in it. And my husband does that now. Even my children who live on their own still look at everything to see how much sodium is in it. And not only just eating at home, but also eating out at restaurants. At first I was real tentative and hesitant to do this, but it takes a lot of questions to be able to eat at a restaurant and not get too much sodium. And I started doing this when I realized how much difference it really makes in how you feel. But it involves the server going back and forth into the kitchen sometimes a lot. They're asking questions like, how's the food prepared? Is the pasta boiled in salted water? What's in the salad dressing? Can we get the sauce on the side? And I've even been known to bring my own low sodium dressing in my purse into a restaurant just in case they don't have a low sodium option.
It's great that your family is so supportive of this and walking with you through this journey. Thank you, Lori. Porothea, how about you? How are you doing now in managing this?
I'm doing fine. My cardiologist says I'm doing well, along with my primary care provider. Being that I have other chronic conditions, I make sure everybody is on the same page. I get in touch with all of them. If I'm at one provider and I say, well, have you got the notes from my primary care provider? And they'll tell me, well, no, I haven't. Well, go get them. Go call them to have them fax over. I'll wait. I don't rush my appointments. I'm patient with it. I have changed the way I eat. And like Lori said, when you're eating out, you do have to really look at that menu and ask questions. I walk the dog 2 blocks every morning. That's about all I can manage before I get a little short of breath. I don't do a lot of things like I used to do. People would call me and I would say I'd get right on it. I don't do that anymore. I have to turn that on into a no and tell them, no, I can't do that. I have to wait on that one. So I have to know my limitations, and that's what it is. It's about knowing your limitations.
That's great. Thank you, Porothea. It seems like you're both good role models for how to take positive steps in managing your heart failure. So thank you for sharing that. So now we know about Lori's HFrEF diagnosis and Porothea's HFpEF diagnosis. And for those of you watching, let us know in the comments if you knew that there were two types of chronic heart failure before this. You can say yes if you did in fact know there were two types of chronic heart failure, or no if you did not. No judging. We just curious and like to know. And Dr. Morris, can you elaborate on why knowing your type of heart failure is so important?
Sure. It's very important because, again, it really does impact the type of treatments that we have available to you. Again, while the two types of heart failure have very, very similar symptoms, HFpEF can be more difficult to diagnose, and again, it can be more difficult to treat. In the end, we want to reduce the chances that our patients have the risk of dying or the risk of going to the hospital because their symptoms have gotten so severe. In the case of HFrEF, we have many, many medications to choose from, many, many devices to choose from. In the case of HFpEF, the options are much, much more limited. And so oftentimes we have to work with patients to try to find options in the case of HFpEF. For both types of heart failure, as Lori and Porothea mentioned, reductions in terms of lifestyle, sodium reduction, physical activity can make a big difference in terms of how patients feel. And so those recommendations are very similar despite the type of heart failure that you have.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Morris and Lori and Porothea, for this great discussion. Before we turn to questions, if you'd like more information on heart failure management and the two types of chronic heart failure, go to keepitpumping.com and womenheart.org. Now we'd like to answer some questions. But as a reminder, we will not be discussing specific treatment options today. And if you have specific questions about your health, please reach out to your healthcare provider. So the first question we'd like to ask comes from Shataika. And she asks, Lori and Porothea, what has been the hardest part of living with heart failure for you, and what helped you overcome it? So Porothea, why don't we start with you on this one?
What has been the hardest is not being able to do the things I used to do. Like I said, I have 14 grandchildren, and their ages range from 16 to 8 months. I used to be able to run around in the park with them. We would go to the amusement parks, ride all the roller coasters, do things like that. Now I have to sit on the sidelines and watch them. And, come on, Mama, play with me, do this, do that. And I have to tell them, Mama has to take it easy. And their little faces look at me and like, oh, but it brightens my day just to know that they still want to do those things with me. So I just have to do things in moderation or in steps. I have a great support system with my family and friends, though.
Great. You have to know your limits. Thanks, Porothea. Lori, how about you? What's been the hardest part for you?
Well, the hardest thing for me, aside from diet that I just talked about, is really accepting that I can't be the perfectionist that I tried to be all my life. I've had to really just accept that good enough is okay. And so when people say, well, how do you do everything with heart failure? The answer is you really don't. You just don't. You plan and you prioritize and you make time for the very most important things. And when you do that, and Porothea talked to this, it's disappointing to yourself a little bit. I wanted to be there to help my children move from their apartment in one state to the other state, or to help my daughter move out of the dorm for the last time, but I couldn't. I'd love to hike the Grand Canyon or go scuba diving with my children, but I'm not going to be able to do that. And so it's disappointing to me, and it's a little bit disappointing to my family. But I think it's also hard when you disappoint other people, maybe your friends or your colleagues who don't fully understand your condition. And you have to really say no, like Porothea was saying, and let them down. But it's been good because I think we've all grown through it. I think we're more empathetic and we're more self-sufficient. And even though for a mom especially, it's just not natural to put yourself first. by putting our health first, we actually become a better mom. And so being really transparent with my family about that and helping them understand those limitations has been the way that I've overcome that.
Great message, Lori. Thanks for sharing. And as you both have pointed out, heart failure can be emotionally challenging. So another question that came in for Lori and Porothea, this one comes from Steph. She asks, how do you stay positive and where have you turned to for support? And I know you've alluded to this already, but Porothea, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, the first thing I do when I wake up in the morning is thank my maker for allowing me to be on the wake up call list and on this side of the earth, because some people didn't wake up and they didn't think that they weren't not going to wake up. So that is one thing that I do every morning. Thank you, Jesus. The other thing is my family, my friends, and my grandkids give me a will to live every day. Sometimes you don't know how much you're loved until things happen. And knowing that my friends all rallied together for me when I became unemployed and everything to help maintain my home showed me a lot. It really showed me a lot along with my family. So you just have to be grateful, and I pay it forward.
Great. And Lori, what about you? What do you do to stay positive?
Yeah, I think you can't, or for me, I can't really escape the emotional impact of heart failure, but I found that I can manage it. It's been a real blessing to me that I haven't been pulled deep into the darkness of depression. And, you know, like Porothea, I attribute that to prayer and church support and a lot of family support. But there are days when I feel a little bit of depression coming on. And it's usually those days when my physical health is not where I want it to be. And it really helped when my cardiologist told me early on, with heart failure, you're going to have good days and you're going to have bad days. Don't be surprised by that. So when you have a bad day, it doesn't mean, oh, the wheels are falling out, or I'm going downhill, or this is the beginning of the end. It just means that it's a bad day. And then later on, you're going to have a good day. So, you know, it's funny, my husband and I went to a zoo a couple years ago, and we saw this haggard, tired looking, really slow moving creature. And its hair looked like it was falling off. I don't know if you can see the picture, but it was a muskox. And that was a sad looking guy. And at the time I thought, you know, sometimes I feel that way. And so now when I'm having a bad day, I just tell my husband, you know, it's a muskox day. And he knows on a day like that, I'm going to be laying on the couch. Nothing's going to get done. And that's going to be okay, because later in the week, I'm going to have a good day. But just knowing that helped me a lot. And then also just reaching out to other people that also have similar situations, similar diagnosis. There's a lot of online support groups that are really very helpful that you can find. WomenHeart has a program called Sister Match, where no matter where you are, no matter where you live, you can be connected to someone that has a similar diagnosis and a similar life situation. And that is a huge support to have someone go through it with you.
Right. And Dr. Morris, you know, their experiences that they just shared really underscore the emotional toll of heart failure. So can you give us your perspective on that?
Sure. I think this conversation about the emotional impact of heart failure is so important because there's clearly a physical side that can be very distressing when you're plagued with the shortness of breath, the fatigue, the symptoms that come with this diagnosis. They can be extremely impactful. So I think, as Lori and Porothea said, it's very important to establish expectations that there are going to be good days, but there are also going to be some bad days. It's important for patients to establish those expectations for themselves, but it's even more important for them to establish those expectations with their families. I think it's also key to have those expectations with their providers and to make sure that their providers are hearing them This can be particularly important if you have the diagnosis, as we mentioned, of HFpEF, because what we don't want is a situation where people are experiencing persistent symptoms of shortness of breath, fatigue, nausea, swelling, and those symptoms are being dismissed and not listened to. We want to make sure that patients are being treated appropriately despite whether they have HFrEF or HFpEF. So if you are continuing to experience symptoms of heart failure and you feel as though for whatever reason your provider is not responding, you may need to seek care and request a second opinion if you feel as though you're not being heard. So for those living with a heart failure diagnosis, remember that it's important for you to take care of yourself emotionally as well as taking care of yourself physically.
Great advice. Thank you, Dr. Morris. And our next question comes from Kalandra, and she wants to know how women can better advocate for themselves when seeking care. But before we hear from Lori and Porothea on this, I want to first go back to Dr. Morris about why this question is so important, particularly with HFpEF, which is lesser understood by healthcare providers.
Sure. Again, it's incredibly important for women to be empowered and to empower each other to seek the best healthcare for themselves. As doctors, again, or nurse practitioners or clinicians, we want to be your partners. We want to work with you. But at the end of the day, you know your body best. And so you know best how you felt 6 months ago, 1 year ago, 6 years ago. And so if you know that this shortness of breath, this weight gain, this swelling is just not you, this is not how you normally feel. You used to be able to walk a mile with no problem, and now you can barely get across the room without having to stop and gasp for air. If you're telling a doctor that and you feel like they're not listening to you and you're not being heard, that just might not be the right doctor for you. And you may need to keep seeking doctors until someone listens. And again, this is particularly important for HFpEF because this can be harder to diagnose. If you know something's not right with your body, you have to be sure to speak up until you find a healthcare provider who's willing to take you seriously and help you find out what's going on with you.
Thank you, Dr. Morris, for sharing that healthcare provider perspective. So important. Now I'd like to turn to Porothea and Lori. So how did you learn to be better advocates for yourselves, and what empowers you most to kind of keep fighting? Porothea.
I learned to be an advocate for myself because, for one, I do have that healthcare background, but I ignored the signs because I was the caretaker of my family. At one end spectrum, I had my mom and my grandmother and my uncle. Then I'm in the middle. Then on the other end of the spectrum, I had my kids. At that time, I didn't have any grandkids at the beginning. So I had to learn to be a little selfish and take time for me. I had to learn not to ignore the signs because 2 weeks before I had my event, I was in Rochester, Minnesota with WomenHeart. And as I was coming back, as I said before, another passenger was asking me, was I okay? And I was having chest pain and I ignored it. And then when I got to the end of the runway and everything and got out to the car, it went away. So I'm like, I'm going home. And it was nothing. It's probably because I was just stressed because of the trip. So I made up excuses. But listen to your body. It's telling you something. It's there. It's screaming, help. So help it out.
Great advice. Thank you. And Lori, how about you? What empowers you?
Well, by nature, I think I'm an information gatherer. And so I am comforted and empowered when I can get information that I feel is accurate information from trusted sources. So all of that has helped me learn how to eat right, like I talked about earlier. Committing to daily exercise, not just when it's nice out, not just when I have extra time, not just but every day making an effort to get out and do something. And, my husband always tells me movement is medicine. And so it's just considered part of what I do every day to try to stay as healthy as I can. Another thing that's really empowering me, as strange as it sounds, is to really make rest a priority. And sometimes it seems super selfish to sleep an extra hour or two. And it's at the cost of other things that I'd rather be doing, but it makes a difference. I've said before that heart failure has changed my life, but I don't want it to be in charge of my life. And so when you first hear the words heart failure, all of a sudden so much becomes out of your control. But at the same time, there's still so much that's in your control. And the things that are in your control are things that really make a difference in the quality of life that you can have, in how you manage the disease, and how you feel every day. And those are things like taking your medications, watching your sodium every day, getting the right amount of rest every day, and then making some sort of effort to exercise every day. And those are things that empower me just to be able to control some of the things that really make a difference in how I feel.
Some great advice. Thank you, Lori. This is our final question now for both of you. What would you say to women who think they may have heart failure symptoms but are afraid or haven't made the time to find out? How about Porothea? Why don't we start with you on this one?
I would tell that person, listen to your body, go get help, go get evaluated. Even if they dismiss you, you got evaluated. Continue to get evaluated. As Dr. Morris said, once you find a provider that will listen to you, do that. That's a journey for you to do. It's a worthwhile journey for you to embark upon in order to stay healthy and on top of what's going on with you.
Great. Lori, how about you?
I would totally agree, Dorothea. I was told early on that a better outcome is possible with an earlier diagnosis. And that kind of hit me between the eyes because I had heart failure symptoms for years, especially shortness of breath. But my husband runs marathons. My daughter was in high school sports, and they were all super in shape. And so when I would fall behind and they would say, Mom, something's not quite right, I would say, you guys are in super good shape. You don't even know what it's like to be a normal person. So either I was in denial, or I was embarrassed, or I didn't want to be seen as a complainer. But for whatever reason, I wasn't giving my doctor all the information that he needed. And so my family doctor, he had been our doctor for decades. He had delivered babies for me. And when he had to diagnose me with heart failure, seemingly out of the blue, he said that was the worst day of his professional career because he couldn't believe he'd missed it all those years. But the truth was, I wasn't telling him everything, and I wasn't giving him the information he needed. And so while I feel bad about that, one thing I try to remember is I can't change the past, but I can affect the future. And so if you think you have symptoms, just go get them checked out. If it's nothing, then you win. And if it turns out that it's something serious, you still win because you're going to end up getting treatment sooner than you would have if you wouldn't have gotten treatment.
Right.
Wow, Lori, that's such a great message to everyone listening. Dr. Morris, I want to wrap up with you. What would you say to women who think they may have heart failure symptoms? What should they do?
Absolutely. I think that Lori and Porothea gave some very important advice and keys there. If you dismiss your symptoms, oftentimes a healthcare provider will as well. The delays in care for heart failure or any cardiac symptom can put women at greater risk for being dismissed by their provider. When you show up complaining of certain symptoms, shortness of breath, chest pain, it can trigger a provider to look for certain diagnoses, whereas if you sort of dismiss them and or don't tell the provider about those symptoms in the first place, they won't think to order certain tests. So it's critical that if you think that something's not right in your body, you have to tell us everything that's going on and you have to get it checked out. And if the symptoms that we've talked about today sound familiar, again, ask your doctor about heart failure and you have to be able to start the conversation with us.
That's right.
Thank you, Dr. Morris. And thank you, Lori and Porothea, for sharing your heart failure journeys. We know everyone's journey is a bit different, and it's been a privilege to hear about yours. HFrEF and HFpAF are different conditions in terms of how they affect the heart, the path to diagnosis, and what is or isn't available for treatment. But it's clear that the two types of chronic heart failure can have a significant impact on women's lives, both emotionally and physically. So be sure to call your doctor if you notice any new or worsening symptoms to prevent it from getting worse or having to go to the hospital. Also, keep in mind that some people have some of the symptoms, but not others. Thank you again for joining us today on this Facebook Live hosted by WomenHeart and sponsored and supported by Novartis Pharmaceuticals Corporation. To hear more inspiring stories, go to womenheart.org and keepitpumping.com. To close our show, we want to share a final piece of inspiration for all of our viewers from the WomenHeart How We Fight campaign. Thank you and be well.
How do I know if I have heart failure?
How do I tell my family about my diagnosis?
If I'm hospitalized for heart failure, what does that mean?
How do I know if my heart failure symptoms are worsening?
When I was diagnosed with heart failure, I was very worried, anxious, and afraid.
When I received my diagnosis, I was at the doctor by myself. And of course, the first thing I thought is, how on earth am I going to tell my family about this?
At first, I had to understand, what is stress? Stress for me is taking on too much, stretching myself too thin, doing too many things without enough time.
So my advice to other women who are going through this would be to, of course, listen to your body and get a sense with how you're doing. But for me, it was more important to listen to those around me.
It's really important that we focus on what our bodies can do and not focus so much on what they can't do.
My advice is to learn to say no. That one word gives you the freedom to give up that too busy lifestyle of doing everything for everyone.
My advice to others is to trust your instincts. If you feel like something's wrong, get it checked out by a doctor.
Being aware of your limitations and your symptoms doesn't make us weak, it makes us strong. Stronger for the future and stronger for our families.
Your story is important. You are not a failure, and you are strong enough for this fight.
I'm a WomenHeart champion.
And this is how we fight.
And this is how we fight.
And this is how we fight.
And this is how we fight.